Civil rights education is essentially citizenship education. The traditional civil rights movement is a great case study of how Americans use their First Amendment freedoms. Those tools are available to everyone. And I think that we can go back to American history and we can see religious groups, for instance, that were discriminated against. Certainly one can see anti-Catholic discrimination at some point in American history, anti-Semitism playing out. So if I were a Muslim American, I would look back to those stories and some of the tactics and the organizing tactics of the civil rights movement might apply as well. Certainly, we can look at the farm workers movement, which was a movement of Latino farm workers in California, and recognize that the civil rights movement is not just for African Americans and it's not just about race. Labor movements are a kind of civil rights movement. So when we start breaking it up into how do people collectively act together, what kind of tactics do they use, how do they use the law or the courts or the court of public opinion to change hearts and minds, policy and law, those are things that can apply to every group and should apply to every group. Going beyond heroes and holidays means also going beyond the typical traditional civil rights movement, which has its kind of begins with Brown versus the Board of Education or the Montgomery bus boycott, and then ends with the assassination of King. And for many people, that's it, or ends with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and now everything is fine. The reality is that in this country, we have had civil rights movements almost from the beginning. And we've had movements to expand the rights of citizens, whether we're talking about the women's rights movement, the abolition movement, of course, which was to bring enslaved people out of slavery and eventually also to ensure that they would be citizens. So it's much bigger over time, and it continues today. And of course, the problem with the heroes and the holidays is that if we just think about a couple of names and a couple of big events, we fail to understand how these movements happen. And we deprive ourselves and our students of the capacity to continue to make change. So it's really important to understand that it wasn't just one leader, that hundreds of thousands of people made individual choices and took risks in their lives to bring about the traditional civil rights movement. That they argued about strategy, that they had fierce opposition, and that the work wasn't done just when the laws were passed, and that much of it still continues today. So I would argue for a much more expansive view that always connects the traditional movement to contemporary movements and to other groups, and that looks much deeper than the heroes and holidays. There's a great argument that can be made that King did not make the movement made King. First of all, we have some films that are about the civil rights movement, and all of our civil rights movement films illustrate the role that youth took in leading the civil rights movement. So for example, we have the Children's March, which is about the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, where a decision was made to have children be on the front lines because if they were arrested, their parents could still go to work and collect a paycheck and not be fired from their jobs. Children had less at stake in a way. It's children who were the target of the fire hoses and the dogs in Birmingham. Our most recent film, Selma, The Bridge to the Ballot, is the story of the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. Most of the time that story is told, it starts with Martin Luther King appearing in Selma in January 1965. We start 2 years earlier, when Bernard Lafayette of SNCC came to Selma and started organizing high school students. High school students were organized in Selma for 2 years, and their organization is one of the reasons that King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose Selma for the voting rights action. So students and young people, there are lots of great examples of them leading. You can look around today and see lots of great examples of students doing things. So on social media, for example, we have a Facebook page, and we're often promoting and posting stories of young people who are taking action. Another great example was a young African American girl who realized that there were just not a lot of young adult books with African American girl heroines. And so she started a campaign to find 1,000 of those books. It went viral on social media, and she found 1,000 of those books. And so the picture is there of her surrounded by 1,000 books. There are students like that all over the place. And telling those stories helps others see that, hey, I'm not that different from that person. If she could do this, I can do that. You've talked about the fact that we live in an increasingly diverse society, and our schools are very diverse. They may be more segregated along social economic lines or along racial lines, but they're still very, very diverse. And this country is among the most diverse in the world. And so for many teachers, many educators, the issue is really, how do we promote diversity in school? How do we appreciate all this difference and make students feel good about each other? And we applaud those efforts. We think that's really, really important. But it's not enough, because you could have a great school climate where people all appreciate each other, but where students are still marginalized and where there's still inequitable practices. And here's where I would suggest that educators go back and not simply look at, are we all getting along, but also ask the question of, are we treating everybody fairly? Does everyone have equal access to the opportunities that we provide? Does everyone have an equal opportunity? And if they don't have an equal access or opportunity, are we giving them the boosts they need to have those opportunities and to have that access? So diversity is great, but it has to be balanced with equity. And for educators, for school leaders, or district leaders, or state leaders, those two things go together. One is about prejudice reduction and getting along, and the other is about building the kind of society that we want our children to inherit.